kept comparing him to my exes, not realizing it hurt him. He left, and now I regret it. Hello, Reddit. My name is Michelle, and I'm 29 years old. I'm a flight attendant, so I get to travel a lot and meet many people. This is my first time here, and funny enough, I'm not here to read stories or anything, but to write mine and ask for advice. My fiancé left me, and I'm so heartbroken and lost, so confused about what I can do to get my relationship back, because I really, really love him. I kept comparing him to my exes, not realizing it hurt him. Well, he left, and now I regret it terribly. Don't blame me just yet. I honestly didn't know that he felt that way because he never said. Well, he did several times, but I just wasn't listening and thought it was a normal thing, talking about my past. You see, what happened was Daniel, my fiancé, was a very handsome guy. We grew up together, and we didn't become lovers until we were out of college. We did everything together, even while we were younger. We were almost inseparable. Most times, I was usually at Daniel's place because I kind of grew up in a dysfunctional home, so Dan's place was a sort of safe zone for me whenever I had to escape my own home. I never knew my father because, according to my mom, he wasn't worth anything, and she never wanted to talk about him at all. Whenever I asked about him, she would flare up and start guilt-tripping me by asking if she didn't do enough for me and telling me she was all I had in life, and I shouldn't lose that by trying to find out about my good-for-nothing father. Eventually, I stopped asking, and if I'm asked about my father, I just tell people he died before I even got to know him. My mother got married 3 times, and each time I was the bridesmaid. It was excruciating each time because I had to watch my mother marry yet another man who was just after her money. She always ended up heartbroken each time because each marriage always ended badly, as each man seemed to have the same goal, exploiting her and also cheating on her with younger women. It was like she never learned her lesson because she kept ending up in the same situations, and each time when I tried voicing out my concern, she'd tell me, "Michelle, this time it'd be different. I promise." But it ended up being the same situation she supposedly avoided. I couldn't bear living with her again after she got married to the 4th man. I wanted to leave as soon as I could, and I was so desperate that the first opportunity I had, I left and didn't come back until I was informed of my mother's accident, which killed her and her newest lover. When I left home, I didn't keep track of how many lovers or husbands she had, so I cannot tell you what number the one who died with her was. Maybe because of my desperate thoughts of leaving home, I developed a love for being a flight attendant. And because I didn't necessarily have to go to college for it, I was happy. I wasn't particularly a smart kid. Daniel was the smart one. I started developing my skills for it, learning different languages, and I learned how to give first aid treatment, among other things. I did everything possible to pass the recruitment process so I could just leave, and luckily I did, and I became a flight attendant at the age of 21. I left before Daniel, and eventually, because I moved to another city entirely far away to stay away from my mother and her constant wedding bells, we lost contact after I moved. Because of my job, I got to travel a lot and meet different people, so my first boyfriend was black. Jason was a very sweet person. He traveled with our airline and took a first-class flight. Now, for people who are reading this and don't understand what first class is, we have some classes of traveling with different airlines, depending on the money you have. First class is the most luxurious and highest level of services offered by airlines, providing an unparalleled level of luxury and personalized attention. So Jason traveled in first class, and I was the one who attended to him, all smiles and, of course, ready to serve. Jason had charmed me with his sophistication and his way of addressing me. Despite the fact that I was only a flight attendant, Jason treated me with the utmost respect, and because we weren't permitted to share our private contact information with customers, I couldn't give Jason mine. Jason, in his romantic delusions, had said if fate wanted us to be together, we would meet again, and this time out of work, so I could finally give him that contact he needed. I had smiled, but in my mind I had hoped we did meet again. Crazy as this may sound, we did meet, and fortunately it was outside the work environment. I was on a break that day, and my friend Molly, who worked as a manager at a company, invited me out for lunch, and I agreed. The plan was that we were going to meet at her workplace, and then together we were going to go hunting for a restaurant to fill our empty stomachs. Mine was empty because I had only had cereal that morning and was too lazy to cook, and hers was probably because she had to get to work early. Jason had somehow been in the building, and when I had stepped off the elevator, I had stepped right into him because I had been talking to Molly, asking for directions, so I had been distracted. I was utterly surprised to see him, and he was pleased to see me and finally got my contact information and a promise from me to have dinner soon enough. I was excited and happy about it, and when I asked Molly about Jason, she told me he was the CEO's son, and he was very rich too. Jason and I started exchanging texts and calls. Sometimes we would even meet up for dinner or lunch, depending on how busy we were. Sometimes Jason would surprise me with breakfast when he knew I had to leave early for work. He was just the sweetest person. He was the perfect guy, and I did not see us not ending up together in the end. I was so in love with Jason, and he loved me too. We dated for 6 months until, shockingly, Jason's engagement was announced. I felt so distraught, and I cried for several days because Jason never told me anything about such a thing. Jason tried to see me and texted me several times, but I wouldn't answer him, and when I eventually did, he told me his parents had set up the match, and that he knew nothing about it. Sadly, he couldn't break it off because his company needed the alliance to merge companies. I didn't even understand most of what he said. Just the part about having no choice in the matter but to get married to the lady was what entered my head. Another thing that shocked me the most was when Jason told me that it didn't stop us and that we could continue our relationship. I wasn't pleased because even though I loved him, I didn't want to be in between a married couple. I knew what my mother's cheating partners did to her, the many nights of hearing her sob across the room whenever she thought I was sound asleep. I was very tempted, I won't lie, because that meant Jason loved me enough to still want to be with me, despite his getting married, and then I understood why partners cheat. But I still couldn't do that to the lady, even though I didn't even know her. I wasn't a religious person, but I still didn't want that on my conscience. So I broke things off with Jason and blocked off any means of contacting me. I even moved from my old apartment. While recovering from Jason and trying to get my life back on track again, I met Mason. It seems like I had a thing for guys whose names ended with son. I met Mason at a restaurant, which he owned, where I went to have dinner alone. I didn't feel like cooking that night, and I wanted to just go out because I was thinking again about Jason. So I decided to treat myself to a meal in an expensive restaurant. Mason apparently saw me when I was sitting and sipping my wine, waiting for my order, while he was about to leave the restaurant when he went to check on how things were going. He said he had slipped back into the kitchen and asked what my order was and prepared it himself. I, on the other hand, had enjoyed the meal so much, and when I was done, I was served dessert courtesy of the chef because I had enjoyed the meal. I was surprised but went along with it and also enjoyed the dessert very much. And when I was done and wanted to pay for my meal, I was told it was already settled. I demanded to know who was behind it, and that was when Mason showed himself and introduced himself to me. I asked him why he had paid my bills when I obviously could, but he told me he couldn't ignore being a handsome savior to the damsel. I told him I wasn't in distress. I enjoyed our little banter, and when it was time to leave, he asked to see me again, and I agreed. We started seeing each other often, mostly at his place, and he was always cooking me delicious delicacies. Mason spoiled me silly, and while I was with him, other restaurants' food tasted like garbage, even my own cooking. I admit that cooking wasn't exactly my forte, but I did still try. However, whenever I was with Mason, I didn't even have to try to be good. He treated me to the best cooking, and I was very happy with him. The reason things didn't exactly work well between Mason and me was the fact that even though Mason knew my profession and that I interacted with several people every time, he was still a very jealous man. At the beginning of our relationship, his jealousy was really cute, and I thought it was something he'd grow out of knowing the nature of my job. But Mason, in fact, overdid it by almost making me lose my job. That day, I had slept over at his place, and I had to leave very early for a flight. I had already told Mason that, and in fact, before we slept, I had set my alarm so I wouldn't have to rush to work. But shockingly, my alarm didn't even ring at all. I checked to see if I had just woken up to the alarm, or maybe it was missed, but I realized that the alarm had been switched off. It was even Jonas's call that woke me up. Jonas and I worked together at the same airline, and he was also a good friend of mine. Once Mason saw who was calling, he became very angry and said I was actually lying about work and that it was Jonas I was cheating on him with. I was very surprised, and I didn't even have time to react because I was very late. Thankfully, the flight had to be canceled because the plane had some technical issues and other planes were not available. But I was still scolded, and my boss had threatened that next time I might not be that lucky. I went back home very angry at Mason, especially since he wasn't even sorry after I texted him the consequences of his actions. Instead, he replied with a, "Thankfully you didn't lose the job," and offered to cook me lunch. I was not happy about it, but I eventually let it go, and it continued like that until I got tired of his tantrums and occasional mood swings whenever he saw me with any guy except himself. I had to eventually break things off with him. Our relationship lasted for 4 months, shorter than that of Jason and me. After Mason, I met Jim. Jim and I met on a blind date set up by Molly, who made it compulsory that I had to go. According to her, I had moped enough about my exes, and I should move on and meet someone because I wasn't going to get married to myself. Jim was a charming person, and he worked as a tech guy. He worked remotely, though, so his work was mobile. Jim didn't talk much, but usually communicated his feelings by buying me gifts. Sometimes it was a nice piece of clothing or a nice set of earrings, and sometimes it was a necklace. I didn't exactly like that Jim didn't talk much. I guess too much of hunch computer and calculations did that to someone. I don't know, I'm just saying. When I wanted to talk sometimes about work and life, he'd just listen to me while tapping away on his computer. At times, he wasn't even listening at all, and when I got angry, he'd buy me gifts and an apology note. I wanted him to apologize with his mouth and tell me sweet words, and we'd get over it, but that wasn't the case, and I eventually got used to his nonverbal ways of communication. Well, sometimes we barely spoke for 2 weeks. He would just send me presents, and I would respond with a thank you text until the gifts reduced and eventually stopped. I found out that Jim had started to date someone else, but I wasn't pained because we didn't even have that connection, if I can call it that. After Jim, I decided to stop dating for a while and just focus on work instead. So when I was called that my mom had an accident and died, I had no choice but to go home since I was her only child. So I took time off work and went back home. Home brought lots of memories, most I didn't want to remember, but clearly memories didn't mind that you didn't want to have them. They were just there. I arranged the whole burial by myself like a robot on auto. I was just hoping the day came and went because I just wanted to forget I ever came home. The day of the burial came, and people showed up and said a few good things about my mother, which I know they did because of me and not exactly because of my mother. My mother wasn't exactly what the town approved of. They had always shown their displeasure, even when I was a kid, and I learned to avoid them. Especially their pitying gaze when my mother forgot to drop the house keys, and I had to sit outside and wait for her to get back from her frolicking around town with one of her most recent lovers. The only escape I had was when Daniel was around, and I was usually at his place for warmth and food, and also friendship. So when I was done with the burial ceremony, I had to stay back and decide what to do with the house. I knew for sure I didn't even want to have any attachments to the town again, since the only person that I had there was already gone. I had gone for a walk to clear my head that day, and I was so lost in thought that when someone grabbed my hand, I had almost gone karate on the person, only to realize it was actually Daniel. I was super happy to see him, and I had hugged him so tightly that I didn't realize I was crying until he started patting my back. Seeing Daniel again just kind of made me realize I had just lost the only family I had, and despite the fact that she wasn't really a good mother to me, I guess I still loved her. I honestly didn't realize that until I saw Daniel. Daniel seemed to somehow bring out all the real emotions in me, even just by seeing him. When I was done crying, Daniel just took me home without saying anything, and eventually it got weird. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years, and on seeing him, all I did was cry on his shoulders. So I tried to make conversation between us, and eventually, things eased between us, and we started to update each other on what has been going on for the past 5 years that we were apart. I sold my mother's house within a week of staying, and had to leave because my leave from work was almost up. Daniel told me that he had come for the burial when he heard the news and knew I would come home, so he had come to see me and pay his respects too. But I left home before he did, with the promise of visiting him whenever I had the chance to. Daniel and I started talking again, and it was really nice. He would call me most times we texted, and when we were less busy, we talked on video, and I really enjoyed talking to Daniel as we used to. Only this time we were mature and had each gone through things. Daniel told me about his past relationships and how they ended, and I told him about mine too. Daniel held me to my promise of coming to visit him, and I did go over to his place. He took me out, and we had a lot of fun, and I began to visit frequently whenever I was free. He too did the same when he was free. I began to develop feelings that weren't friend-related emotions for Daniel. At first I ignored it because I thought it was because we had just reconnected and were always talking and texting or visiting. But the feelings grew very fast, and within 6 months of reconnecting with Daniel again, I was madly in love with him. Though I noticed that Daniel had the same feelings as I did, he didn't say anything about it. He'd just beat around the bush most times, and it frustrated me. Sometimes when I went over to his place, when we talked, watched movies together, and did all the romantic stuff that couples do, I would expect that he'd just grab me and kiss me, but Daniel would rather excuse himself and go do something very irrelevant and ruin the moment. Other times I'd try to steer the conversation to that end, but Daniel would just either say work came up or he had to go and end the conversation. I was really frustrated so much that I eventually took the initiative. I had gone to his place again that day and intended on spending the night before going back home the next day. That day, I had promised myself that I wasn't going to let him avoid that conversation again, and I set the mood. I had his house keys with me, and he didn't even know I was visiting that day and had obviously gone to work. Knowing the time that he'd be back, I cooked his dinner and even set some scented candles on the table and dimmed the lights. I showered and dressed in my sexy lingerie, which I had bought earlier that day. So when Daniel was back from work, he was surprised to see me, and when I moved towards him, he thought I was going to hug him, but instead I kissed him. Daniel was so surprised, but I just smiled and asked him to eat. All through dinner, he just kept glancing across the table at me, and I was grinning because I knew what I wanted to do. When we finished dinner, I told him I wanted to talk to him, and when he sat, I told him about my feelings. Daniel, the shy boy, stuttered while trying to tell me he felt the same way. I remember that night I smiled, kissed him, and asked him to be my boyfriend, and he agreed. We had sex that night, but of course I initiated it, seeing that Daniel couldn't muster the courage to ask for sex. We started dating, and Daniel clearly didn't know how to please a woman. I had to tell him to buy me gifts on special occasions or even randomly. Sometimes he'd call me to ask which gifts I'd prefer or like to have. He didn't surprise me with random dates like my exes did. He'd rather call me and inform me sometimes days ahead before coming to take me on a date. He had a schedule that he followed strictly. He didn't do anything surprising or random for me, and that made the relationship very boring for me. I loved Daniel very much, but I wanted spontaneity, and Daniel was not giving me that at all. So I started to drop hints about how he should treat a woman he loves. I'd send him videos that I saw online of surprises guys pulled on their women. But Daniel still didn't get the memo, and it frustrated me. So whenever we were together, I'd start telling him stories of how my exes were with me, how spoiled I was from my last relationships, and how many gifts I got randomly. Daniel would just keep quiet and listen to me tell stories of how rich they were. Sometimes I even told him that he was the least wealthy amongst the guys I've been with, and even showed him pictures of the dates I had with my previous boyfriends. Sometimes he'd walk away with some excuse about work. I never knew that it was hurting him, me telling him that he wasn't up to the standard of my exes. There was one time I wore a dress, matching shoes, and a bag with diamond earrings bought for me by Jim, and I wore that to a date I had with Daniel. When he complimented how beautiful I looked, I told him it was a gift from my ex, and that everything was worth more than even his car and house. I know now, as I write this, how terrible it must have been for him to endure my storytelling. I feel so horrible about how poorly I treated Daniel. Daniel started buying me gifts, but when he did, I complained about how cheap they were, and he eventually stopped, which made me angry at him. Daniel was a planner. He planned his year ahead, the things he wanted to achieve before the year ended and all that. But I saw that as a waste of time because I believed that life is spontaneous, so I just wanted to be spontaneous with it. I just wanted to spend money without worrying about the next day, but Daniel wasn't like that. He wanted to save up to buy a better apartment and a better car, but I didn't understand then, and tagged him as a weak man and a coward who was afraid to spend his own money. One time, I was sitting in my room scrolling through my pictures, and I came across one I took with Jason. We had been on a cruise ship enjoying ourselves. Jason had just called me and asked if I was busy that day, and I had just gotten off work, so I said no, and he sent a driver to pick me up. It had been my first time on a ship, and I had been so happy that I took a picture with Jason in the background for memories. I hadn't even posted the picture because I just wanted to keep it on my phone and enjoy the private moment alone. The picture brought sweet memories of Jason to me, and I texted him a hi before I realized what I did. I had eventually unblocked him when I knew I had moved on from him. That was when I was dating Jim. So when I texted him, I was still trying to delete the message when his reply came in. I was kind of happy at the speed he replied to me and somehow felt special. We started texting after that. We would talk for long periods, and most times he would tell me how unhappy he was in his marriage and how he wished we were still together. I was feeling special that after all that time had passed, he still felt the same way about me. When he invited me out for lunch, I first refused but later agreed. Seeing Jason after so long brought back feelings that I didn't even know were still there. And lunch with him was pretty amazing as we dined at one of the most exquisite restaurants. We started meeting often, and I started having less time for Daniel. One time he texted me that he was at my place waiting for me, and I was with Jason. I had forgotten that day that Daniel was coming over, but because my mind was filled with Jason. When Jason texted me and told me he had special plans in place that only needed me to be complete, I left my house and raced over to where Jason had asked me to meet up. He took me to a museum and afterward to watch a football match, and then from there, we went to his hotel where he stayed and ate dinner. I lied to Daniel, saying that one of my coworkers got sick and I had to stand in for her, and Daniel had to travel back home that evening. I felt guilty, but I was so overwhelmed with Jason that I just didn't want to stop. Before long, Jason and I started having sex again, despite the fact that he was married and I was in a relationship with Daniel. In my head, we were just playing each other, no strings attached. He spent money on me, and he got sex in return. I was very happy being able to spend money again without restrictions, and I even stopped nagging Daniel and asking him for money. I loved him very much, but I just couldn't help myself from cheating on him with Jason because of the luxurious life I got to live. When our relationship was 2 years old, Daniel asked me to be his wife. I was shocked because it wasn't something I expected. I mean, not that I didn't expect it or want it, but it wasn't something I nagged Daniel about. Daniel had come to my workplace when I had just come back from a flight. He had asked about my work, and when I was finishing that day, and I told him the truth because Jason was out of the country with his wife for work, so I didn't have to lie about it. I thought he was asking because he just wanted to know and not for anything else, but I was just getting off the plane and was still distracted, especially when I heard people screaming in the airport. It wasn't until I was down completely that I saw Daniel on one knee, holding a ring and a card that read, "Will you marry me?" in the airport. I was so shocked and excited that I said yes. The applause, whistling, and congratulations were deafening as customers, people who had come to meet their loved ones, and my coworkers were all there. I was really happy and pleased when Daniel took me home. Well, that happiness was very short-lived because the very day I got engaged was the same day Daniel left me. That happened when I went to my room to take a bath and change into my pajamas while Daniel ordered our food on my phone. I told him to order from my phone because I had a particular restaurant that I always ordered from, and because they were efficient in delivering quickly, so I told him to just use my phone to place the order while I took my bath. After I finished bathing and was putting on my pajamas, I heard the door bang shut, and I thought it was Daniel collecting the food we ordered, but when I went into the kitchen, expecting my nose to be filled with the wonderful aroma of food, I smelled nothing, and I didn't see Daniel either. I was surprised and went to check for him in the other rooms, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I even went to the garage, and his car was gone. I was very surprised because Daniel hadn't told me he was leaving or anything like that. When I heard the doorbell, I quickly sprang up to check if it was Daniel, but it was just the delivery man. I became worried and took my phone to try calling him, but what I saw made my blood run cold. My phone was unlocked, and the chats I had with Jason were on display, and the texts were PG-18 texts. Jason had even sent a recent text, and it was the video of my proposal. He had asked what was going to happen to us if I got married to Daniel. Daniel had seen the texts. I was so scared and started to call Daniel, but he wasn't picking up his calls or replying to any of my texts. I was very worried and couldn't even sleep throughout the night. The food Daniel had ordered for us was still where I left it because I lost my appetite. I didn't know what I was going to tell Daniel or what excuse I was going to give. The next day, I begged a coworker of mine to stand in for me, and she thought it was because I wanted to spend more time with my fiancé, and I let her think that. I traveled down to Daniel's place, and he had already left for work. So since I had his spare key, I opened the door, let myself in, and waited anxiously for Daniel to come back home. When Daniel came back and saw me, his face hardened, and he looked very angry. That was the first time in my life I ever saw Daniel angry. He had always been cool-headed and minded his own business, but I guess I brought out the beast in him. I tried to explain and apologize for everything, and Daniel only told me that the whole engagement and the relationship were over because he had always been the fourth man in my life anyways, as I always had to every time compare him to my exes, and even eventually went ahead to cheat on him with one of my exes. I cried and pleaded with Daniel, but Daniel had made up his mind and asked that I leave his house. I went back home dejected and heartbroken. I ruined everything with my own hands, so here I am desperately pleading for help. I know what I did was terrible, horrible, and any other adjective you have to compare it with, but please help me get my man back. Any advice on how else I could get Daniel to forgive me will be much appreciated, please. Please, I just really want Daniel back. I can't lose him. He's the only one left for me, and without him, I'm all alone in this world. Update. Hello Reddit, it's Michelle again. I cannot begin to express how heartbroken I am right now. I feel like I've been crushed several times by a grinder. My heart feels heavy, so heavy it affects everything I do now. I ruined my life with my own hands, I know, and every day is a big reminder of what I should have had and lost. Daniel is the most wonderful person I could ever have had around me, and yet due to my foolishness, my insatiable appetite for luxury made me lose him. I'm all alone in this world. I have absolutely nobody. Nobody to tell my story to, nobody to even talk to about my feelings. That's why I came to this app, seeking desperate help, but I got none. Instead, I got slander and abuse, and all that reminds me of how unworthy I am of Daniel's affection. After everything that happened with Daniel, I broke things off with Jason. He was the reason I lost the best man. And now, as I heard, I apparently wasn't the only lover Jason had. His wife found out and is filing for a divorce and a huge alimony, and also transfer of ownership of the company since her family had the larger share. He's as doomed as I am. I've been placed on suspension because I started concentrating less and shouted at not one, but 3 customers while at work. It hasn't even been decided what to do with me yet, but I already know that it probably won't be something good, as 2 of the people I got into an argument with are some of our best customers. I feel so ashamed of myself for ever comparing Daniel with any of my exes. It's like after the breakup, I see things very clearly, and I know now, regrettably, that they weren't half the man that Daniel is. Daniel was my confidant, my best friend, and my lover, and I stupidly lost all of it together. Every time I call now to try and even say sorry, Daniel wouldn't even pick up my calls or return them. I've sent literally hundreds of texts telling him how sorry I was and how much regret I have for losing what we had. Daniel reads them but never responds to them. I cannot even forgive myself when I think about what I did to hurt him. Now I have nothing to me. My job is hanging by a very thin thread, my relationship is non-existent, and I have no one to talk to, except on this app, where all I get are more regrets. These days, all I do is just stare for hours at my ceiling and think about how my stupid actions are now affecting my life. I think about how things could have been more different if I hadn't started comparing Daniel with my exes, and if I hadn't gone ahead to cheat on him with one of them again. I regret so much everything I did. Now even the expensive dresses, shoes, and jewelry that fill up my wardrobe look like garbage to me. all expensive and yet have no great memories to them. I lie in bed all day wearing Daniel's sweatshirt that he forgot at my place when he came one time, and I'm afraid to even wash it so his scent wouldn't leave the cloth. I'm so stupid. I feel so stupid. I feel so empty. I've eventually gone and done the worst thing that I could ever do to myself, and now all I'm left with is a hell of my own making. The emptiness I feel hurts. I don't know how emptiness can hurt this badly, but it hurts so much I feel like my heart's being shredded into a million pieces, and the most painful thing is I caused it all. I wish. If I could still get to wish, that is. I wish that I could turn back the hands of time to way before I even texted Jason, to way back when I started comparing Daniel to my exes. But that's all I can do, right? Wishing, but it can never happen. I'm stuck with my own stupid actions and their consequences. Update. Hello, Reddit. This is my very last post here, and I just wanted to say thank you for letting me express my darkest emotions and feelings here. I just hope that my own ending wouldn't be yours, guys. Thanks and goodbye.